Thank you, Pauline. May I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. As State Archivist of the State Records Office in WA, I am delighted to both sponsor the Loris Williams Memorial Lecture and introduce this year's speaker. The aim of the Loris Williams Memorial Lecture, which is always held in conjunction with the ASA conference, is to inspire, challenge, and inform archivists and record keepers about Indigenous issues which affect the profession. The lecture honours Loris Williams, a passionate advocate for the right of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to use archives as a means of reconnecting with their family, country, and Indigenous identity. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Claire G. Coleman, a Noongar woman and award-winning science fiction writer. Claire's debut novel, Terra Nullius, has been shortlisted for a number of awards, in fact too numerous to mention, and she recently won the 2018 Norma K. Hemming Award for excellence in the exploration of themes of race, gender, sexuality, class, or disability in speculative fiction. Born in Perth, Claire has lived most of her life in Victoria and Melbourne. She was inspired by her travels around Australia and by her understanding of Aboriginal and Indigenous history. Her novel examines past, present, and future to present a post-apocalyptic vision of Australia. Publishers Weekly said of her book, artfully combining elements of literary, historical, and speculative fiction, this allegorical novel is surprising and unforgettable. Claire has kindly agreed to take any questions you may have at the end of this session. So without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Claire G. Coleman to deliver the Loris Williams Memorial Lecture.
That was a great introduction, thank you. Makes me sound actually like I know something. My name's Claire G. Coleman. I'm a Noongar woman, but my country is not here in Jebel Yarragon, although I was born here. My country is way down south and east, but the people around here are my Noongar family and country people. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded, stolen lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects to the Whadjuk elders, those that have passed, those that are teaching culture to the young ones and keeping our families together, and those who will one day be elders themselves. I also acknowledge all other First Nations people in the audience. These are trying times. Stay strong. History is fake news. I do worry about the archives. I worry about the material that will teach the future people about who we are, what these times are like. Even though I'm not an archivist, I'm just a writer. Unfortunately, it does not require an archivist to identify precisely how bad things are getting and how bad things are going to get. Data rot. Loss of data through minor technical failure. You don't need much to go wrong to lose data. A single corrupted bit can break an entire file. The complete failure of computers and hard drives, poor maintenance, poor management of digital archives, all these things can lead to the loss of important information. Even data backed up on optical discs, far less prone to data rot than magnetic media, can fail. Media is not perfect. CDs can be eaten by fungus. Most people are surprised by this one. I heard about it when I was doing a computer science degree back at the start of the millennium. But in 2001, Dr. Victor Cardines of the Department of Geology and Soil Science at Ugent, Belgium, found a fungus eating its way into one of his favourite CDs. Think about it. A fungus that eats CDs is pretty damn cool. It struck me that the first fungus found eating a compact disc was either Geotrichum candidum or a close relative. Geotrichum candidum, if you don't know this, is used to make a particularly delicious cheese, my girlfriend's favourite, that one there. This photo is a cheese called La Luna by Holy Goat out of Victoria. It's a world champion cheese. It's one of the greatest cheeses in the world. and it uses a fungus that eats CDs. But data loss is not the worst risk to the archive. Most of the information we now produce is not even recorded, stored or archived. Some of it is not produced in a method that can be archived. A common example being used by many people in describing this problem is letters. Love letters, business letters, confessions, all the many things we used to say by post. This information is now mostly, if not exclusively, communicated by SMS and email. Electronic formats that disappear when a new phone is purchased, when an email service disappears, or when someone decides to change email provider. Think about it. Every SMS you ever send is lost when you change phones, no matter how important they are. I have lost email services in my many years using the internet, addresses associated with my email with my service provider, that before webmail services was the only way to have email. The email address when I was at uni, all gone. Webmail services that ceased operation without warning. If there were important emails in any of those services, they are long gone. Some people are privileged to receive boxes of photos, letters from deceased members of their family. It can be informative to discover by old faded letters on yellow paper how our grandparents, our great-grandparents met, fell in love, built lives, had children. This information is used to build biographies. None of our grandchildren will have access to that sort of information ever again. You or your children, if you're old enough to remember letters on paper, would have sent your first confession of love to the person you loved by SMS. I know I did. Websites are moved or deleted, they're updated and old versions lost. Email companies go out of business. Ebook services have died in a short time. We've had ebooks, and that's a very short time. Sony dropped the ebook reader and the ebook service, handing over their accounts to Kobo. I know this because I had ebooks that were on this Sony ebook service. And then you can't even find out about it. You search for Sony ebook reader and it's like it never existed, and that was only about 3 years ago. Oyster, a subscription ebook service, went out of business about 6 months after they started. I cannot imagine how difficult it will be in 100 years if someone were to write a biography of me, of any other person living today. The sort of information they commonly use now as references such as letters, newspapers, correspondence, purchase receipts, real estate records, etc. are now digital and completely vulnerable to disappearance, even if someone had bothered to record them. The provenance of art is at risk. I collect art. Researchers use items like sales receipts to prove who owns a piece of art, even if that art is, or even if the art is authentic. I know for a fact that people print their evidence of provenance that they get by email because they fear they'll lose the evidence that they own a piece of art. The receipt for the iPad I'm reading from was digital because the place that sold it to me was aware that printed receipts fade in less than a year. Yet, we're expected to keep receipts for tax purposes for 7 years. I doubt any of you or I can be audited by the tax department and not be completely screwed. Somebody I know, when looking through photo albums of their organisation, found a gap with no photos. They later determined that said gap was during the early days of digital, when people didn't bother to print their photos. They'd been stored in a computer, which is now broken. Someone else had no baby photos of their second child, born in the early days of digital cameras. They assume they'd saved them only on the camera card, which has since been thrown out a long time ago. Or was probably from a format that doesn't exist anymore because the early days of digital cameras use different formats. Most people, I and probably you, have gaps in your photographic record in the early days of digital cameras. Everybody does. I'm fairly certain I don't have to actually tell you, a room full of archivists, about the chunks missing in what is going into the archive. But the missing data is not the worst risk to the archive. The biggest risk to the archive is fake news being kept in the archive as truth. If we are all not careful, fake news can become our history. These days, the news cycle is overwhelmed by fake news and articles proving said fake news fake. What dominates the news cycle can enter the archive. Without context, the archive cannot be effectively questioned. In 100 years, when we're all dead, fake news will most likely have slipped into history. Once it's in history, how does it get disproven when there will be no effective print archive anymore? How do I know fake news is archived? It has already happened in the history of Australia and this country's understanding of Indigenous people. Project Officer in First Nations Programming at the Australian Museum and Wiradjuri man Nathan Sentence summarised perfectly on Twitter, and he gave me permission to put this up here. He summarised on Twitter when he said, "Fake news is currently a most discussed topic, but for First Nations people, fake news has been around for a long time. Only it's called history." I would like to illustrate in a poem I wrote called Strawberry Juice, published in edition 7.1 of the Australian Poetry Journal. I think it's relevant. My page is spotted with strawberry juice. They were plump, pink, crisp, surprisingly juicy. The juice stains anemic on the page, fading pale like my family's skin. No solid stain like blood these. 2 blood stains, they would be weak, soft, vanilla. When they dry, they will dry brown. I'm not used now to writing on paper. I forget how it stains, how indelible marks on paper are. So unlike a screen. No matter what sticks to a screen, you can just wipe it off. I'd forgotten how. If you rub paper, even the cleanest of hands leave a mark. They kept records of whites in paper, on ink, in all those years ago, long before computers existed. The paper was fragile as the lives whose endings they recorded. The paper was fragile. The words were not. Screens are hard glass, cold, breakable but never terrible, durable in a glassy kind of way. Splash them, drink strawberry juice on them, and there's a chance of salvation, a chance to not harm if you can wipe it off. Bloodstains do not stay on a screen. Imagine if, when they got permission to kill, it was by email, so easy to delete. They did it on paper. They killed on paper before they did with guns, horses, poison. That paper is still there, too precious to discard. That's why we know what they did. Our lives, our deaths were recorded on paper, and on that paper they soaked in like strawberry juice soaks in. You cannot remove it and leave their precious paper intact. Clean white paper. On black paper, it would have just soaken in like institutional trauma, like generational trauma, and disappear. No stain would show. And yet the stain is still there. You can write on paper, on black paper, but you cannot read it. My page is stained with strawberry juice, and I like the strawberries. They're simultaneously sweet and tart. My page is stained with scrawls of ink, my scrawls, black ink. I've tattooed the paper. Notice how the black of the ink covers over the white paper. Notice how the white page is empty. Notice how paper covers rock, covers my country, my people are one. Notice how easily paper tears. I'm eating strawberries. I have no guilt. I like the strawberries, although they're white fella fruit, although they were grown on stolen land. You like strawberries. The white fella, he likes strawberries, even when they're grown on stolen land. I'm certain they were grown on stolen land, the death, the blood. You think it would make the fruit bitter, sweet fruit from bitter soil, tart fruit from bitter soil. And that, if you were interested in that was in Australian Poetry Journal. Thanks. It has been the work of generations of Indigenous academics and writers to dig through the archives and discover the proofs that undermine the lies on which this country was built. Sometimes it seems that my life's work is questioning the lie of Australian history. I wrote this novel. It's really big. Terra Nullius, because I was deathly sick of being told the invasion of Australia was a long time ago. It wasn't. And that the colonisation was not violent. It was. In Terra Nullius, I utilised fake archive to what I've been told was great effect. There's a bit of a spoiler, but not the worst spoiler in my novel if you're going to read it. It's actually really minor. Every chapter begins with an archival extract, and not one of them is true. However, people who don't know that believe they all are. Because writing fake archive, writing a convincing source, is not hard to do. Allow me to demonstrate. I've got a reading from my book here of a fake archive I wrote. This is a letter from the United Graziers Association. There is nothing more important to us and to you all than the economic health of this colony. Without the economic independence, we can never hope to gain political independence from home. That was a condition that was laid upon us. So long as we are dependent on assistance from home, we can never help to be self-governing. Grazing of livestock and the effective export of the fruits of that labour is the simplest, the fastest, most fastest way forward towards economic power. The only thing standing in our way, the main limitations to our growth, is the depredations of the criminal, aggressive and intransigent natives. As long as our livestock is not safe from the immoral and illegal actions of these primitives, we will not be a real country. We call upon the government of the colony to assist us in the control of this menace. We need more police with more discretionary powers. All the natives who endanger our livestock must be arrested and tried for that crime. It does not matter which native killed the stock. Without doubt, every native has joined in the savage pagan feasting they are no doubt partaking of and at our expense. Every man, woman and child is involved either directly or as accessories to that crime. If, as we suspect, every native is involved in livestock killing, every native must be arrested and punished. The danger must be eliminated at any cost. Fake archive is a common trope in science fiction and speculative fiction. It's used to build a world and set up the story. Entire novels, like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, are written as false archive. The Handmaid's Tale is revealed at the end to be a historical record transcribed from audio tapes of one of the few records left from a dictatorship. Some of the fake news in Australian history is so obvious that it seems bloody ridiculous that anyone would believe it at all. Let's start with the obvious. Captain Cook discovered Australia. Anyone who believes that is willfully ignorant of history. Cook captained the first British ship to intentionally explore Australia. Not the person to discover Australia. Surely that title belongs to the people who lived here for more than 60,000 years. Cook's ship was not the first ship to land here this millennium. That was the Macassans, who had traded with the Yolngu people for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Cook's ship was not even the first European ship to arrive here. The British were beaten discovering Australia by the Dutch. In fact, it doesn't even take a moment of research. You can just look it up on the internet to discover that the first English people to sight or land on Australia were the crew of the Trial and their captain John Brooke, who was shipwrecked off Western Australia in 1622, 150 years before Cook. And yet, the government wants to build monuments to Cook discovering Australia. Cook used maps from other explorers to even find this continent. I cannot express this strongly enough. Captain James Cook did not discover Australia, and saying he did is fake news. Yet that fake news is part of the foundation legend of a fantasy land called Australia. That fake news drives the attitudes, the behaviour, the monument building of many Australians. That fake news justifies racism and hate against people of colour even today. Australians have a superpower, an exceptional ability to believe more than one contradictory statement at a time. Example, Aboriginal people who have been here for 60,000 years can be believed at the same time as the English were here first. The problem with this fake news and fake history with these lies is that the archives and museums are never neutral. The neutrality of memory institutions is assumed, and nobody likes to think of museums and libraries as part of the colonial apparatus. However, many Indigenous people have become aware that institutions were developed under white gaze, and it was a white gaze that determined what material has value and defines truth. Nathan Sentence again, in his blog The Archive of Decolonists, had a post. He refused to swear, but I will swear. Museums are not fucking neutral. And he said, museums and libraries and archives cannot remain objective or neutral because they never were. The stance that museums and archives have sustained and maintained the colonial point of view under which they were created is not unreasonable. You have to admit that. Every archivist is human, and to believe they can leave their own biases out of their practice is to misunderstand human nature. Therefore, we have to acknowledge that the entire structure of the institutions of the archives is colonial because they were founded in Australia by colonisers. Fake news is embedded in Australia's history. Starting from the lie of the declaration of Terra Nullius and the attitude of white Australians to continue to say they were here first. In 2005, watching the Cronulla riots on TV, when white Sydney-siders attacked the people they called Levs, I saw a racist dickhead with "We grew here, you flew here," written on his chest with a Sharpie. Frankly, what a fucking dickhead. The first thing I thought, as soon as I saw that, and it's hard to say in a way that makes sense because there's a homophone in my sentence, but this is my first thought, back in 2005. Yes, white Australians often forget that the first of them got here by boat. Despite the Mabo decision, despite the correction of the official history of Australia, white Australians continue to act like they were the first human beings on this continent. That photo was in 2005, 12 years after the Mabo decision that stated the obvious, that Indigenous people were here before white people came. The gentleman in that photo doesn't look older than about 20. I've seen a photo of the version with his face, but decided not to use that one. So Mabo had happened when he was about 8. Therefore, assuming he went to school at all, there was ample opportunity for him to learn the truth, yet clearly he did not. There's a scene in the John Pilger documentary Utopia when John is interviewing people about Australia, asking them what Aboriginal people think of them celebrating the day the country was invaded. One idiot, a young man again, there's a pattern here, said of Aboriginal people, it doesn't matter where they came from, they're Australian now. Sure, that's just one idiot, right? How many of those idiots do you think there really are? I think there's quite a few, more than you think. There's a saying I love, though I have no idea who said it first, it was used in law, which is you can't unring a bell. It refers to the fact that once a statement is made to a jury, doesn't matter if they're told to withdraw the statement, the jury will still know it, it'll still be in their unconscious. In the case of history, that can be true. It doesn't matter what the truth is, what matters is what people believe. And that can be what they heard first, or what best suits their perceived best interests. The best way to ensure fake news does not become history, is to be vigilant. Always keep it out of the history and the archives before it even gets there. Imagine, if you will, if the concept that Indigenous Australians were nomads and simple hunter-gatherers before white people arrived and saved us from us was a lie. Earlier this year, I was at Cales Crossing, a crocodile-infested ford from Kakadu National Park to Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, when a tour guide said of the people of Arnhem Land across the river, quote, "They are not nomads anymore, we built them houses." Incidentally, he was a recent immigrant as well. He had a South African accent, therefore he didn't have anything to do with building houses in Arnhem Land, even if they did. It's a lie. There were nomads in Australia in the desert, but the assumption that all Indigenous people were nomadic is a lie. A real, heavy, big, scary lie. I've written on this myth more than once, and I'm far from the first person or the most qualified or possibly the person who did the best job of it. A few years ago, Bruce Pascoe, I don't know if you've all heard of him, a Bunurong man, Victoria, wrote a book. You might have heard of it. It was called Dark Emu and published by Mugabala Books. That's it there. That's the old cover. I use that one because it's prettier than the new cover. He used historical documents, particularly the diaries of colonisers and explorers, to prove that the prevalent belief in Australia that Indigenous people were nomadic was fake. False. A lie, if you will. In essence, he used the archive to correct a common myth used in the abuse of Aboriginal people and culture. I will say it again. Aboriginal people were never nomadic hunter-gatherers, at least not all of us. We farmed, we had settled lives, we built houses in towns. In Victoria, in Gunditjmara country, for example, they found the oldest aquaculture facility in the world, along with a village of stone houses that was still in use to the moment white people got there. In fact, the idea that we were nomads seems to have been a recent one. It was known up to the beginning of the 20th century that we had settled lives, built houses and farmed. Since then, the myth that we were nomads has dominated to the point that to say otherwise, to argue against it, is considered complete madness. I have often wondered how this myth was created when it became considered uncontestable fact. I do know what purpose the myth served. It shores up the lie of Terra Nullius. Imagine, though, what would have happened if the archives were not there for Bruce Pascoe and other historians to access. We would be incapable of proving the assumptions of a society false using the archive. Bearing in mind these truths, we must be vigilant regarding what is chosen to add to the archive. In the current milieu, it has become normal to push lies as truth, to produce fake news for shits and giggles or propaganda purposes. Some fake news is so mind-bogglingly stupid, it seems impossible to imagine that anyone could believe it. But people do believe it. I cannot imagine anymore there is any claim so ludicrous that there will not be some people out there who take it as fact. I can give an example. A meta-conspiracy theory called QAnon on the internet. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It is completely nuts. It's a belief. Now, I'll explain, this will tell you how nuts it is. I don't have to tell you how nuts it is, I'll just tell you what it is. It's a belief that a cult of child-eating pedophiles control the governments of the entire world, and that the tangerine terror, Donald Trump, has taken control of the USA to expose and eliminate them. Q, they call him, their hero, is, or so they say, a senior member of the US bureaucracy who drops some clues about Trump's plans. I stumbled upon this lunacy on Twitter. My public profile and my desire to wade in when a friend is being trolled has attracted these nutters into my mentions. If you look it up, it will eat your brain as you dig into the tangled web of this lunacy. I suggest you don't go there, you will probably regret it. I can almost guarantee that time in the corners of the internet with QAnon bakers, as they call themselves, because they're obsessed with breadcrumbs, hangout will genuinely make you stupider. The risk of conspiracy theories like QAnon is not that they exist, but that new computer technology makes it easier to produce fake video. Face swap apps that can apparently run on an iPad like this one can currently quite convincingly swap faces on videos, making it harder to know what is true and what is lies. They can animate a face completely realistically using motion capture and tons of video footage, and they can do it almost instantly. How can you identify fake news when any person with the right app and too much time on their hands can make a convincing digital puppet show and make that puppet say anything? If any nutty theory is believed, there is no certain or sure way to inoculate the archives against nutty theories becoming a part of history. Wow, I'm running out of time. The experience of Indigenous Australia proves that. The only protection history has against lies is historians and archivists such as you out there. It might be genuinely impossible to stop lies being recorded as truth. If that is possible, it's the job of archivists, who might be the only people standing between us and fake news. So what can be done about the fake history of Australia? For a start, the archives need to be re-examined. How they're interpreted needs to be understood. Bruce Pascoe, not a trained historian or archivist, except as much as many of my Indigenous brothers and sisters are, found enough evidence in the archives and the historical reports of the invaders and explorers to bring the understanding of Indigenous culture most Australians believe into question. Imagine what a trained archivist or historian can find if they look hard enough. It's time for some of the burden of disproving white lies be shifted from the shoulders of Indigenous people and onto the white people. It's time for settlers to clean up their own mess. Our museums and archives are not neutral, they have always been political. To claim neutrality is false. To attempt to maintain neutrality in an ecology of lies is to take the side of liars and the oppressors. It's time for archivists and historians to speak up when lies are uttered, otherwise fake news will become our only news. It happened with Indigenous Australians, character assassinations on the scale of an entire culture. It can happen to others too. If you're not worried about that, you should be. Thank you.